Elon Musk destroys TV host. His response leaves America in shock. Picture this. You're sitting in a live TV studio, surrounded by hundreds of spectators, eyes glued to the stage. You can feel it. Something seismic is about to unfold. The lights are blinding, cutting through the tension that hangs heavy in the air. The hum of cameras rolling, the quiet shifting of the audience in their seats. Everything is building up to one defining moment. At the center of it all sits Elon Musk, a man who has reshaped industries, defied the establishment, and turned the impossible into reality. He doesn't just play the game, he changes it. His hands rest lightly on the chair's arms, his expression unreadable, yet his presence alone commands the room. Across from him sits Rachel Dawson, the sharpest journalist in America. The woman known for making even the most powerful crumble under her relentless questioning. Her eyes are locked on Musk, unwavering, ready to expose what she believes the world needs to see. For a moment, the room is silent. The producer's voice crackles through the earpiece. We're live in 3, 2, 1. The screen behind them ignites. Truth exposed. Rachel leans forward, her voice smooth but laced with an edge. Elon Musk, welcome to the program. Musk smirks, his posture unshaken. This should be interesting, but no one, not the audience, not the crew, not even Rachel herself, could have predicted what happens next. Because Musk isn't here to defend himself. He's here to turn the entire game upside down. The tension in the studio was palpable. It was the kind of charged silence that only happens when something extraordinary is about to unfold. The audience sat frozen, their eyes darting between the two figures in the spotlight. Elon Musk, the maverick billionaire with an almost supernatural ability to challenge the status quo, and Rachel Dawson, the relentless journalist with a reputation for dismantling even the most untouchable figures. Rachel took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had faced senators, CEOs, and world leaders, but something about Musk was different. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't shifting in his seat, second-guessing his words, or scrambling for a defense. No, he was waiting, watching, calculating. She wouldn't let that shake her. She had a job to do. Rachel's fingers tapped lightly against her stack of notes, the sound barely audible, but carrying the weight of intention. Her opening move had to land. She leaned in, her voice precise and deliberate. Let's get straight to it, Elon. You've built an empire, changed the world in ways most people can't even comprehend. But lately, the public conversation around you has shifted. She let the words settle, watching him closely. Some call you a genius. She paused, then let her next words cut through like a knife. Others call you reckless, a troublemaker, a man who wields too much power and isn't afraid to break the rules, no matter the consequences. The silence in the room deepened. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Musk didn't blink. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, the faintest hint of amusement flickering across his face. Then, with deliberate slowness, he asked the one question that would change the course of the interview entirely. Rachel, who exactly are these people you're referring to? For the first time that night, Rachel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Musk caught it. The audience caught it. The shift was nearly imperceptible, but it was there. She recovered quickly, pressing forward. The public, Elon. The people who once admired you, who now question whether your actions are truly for innovation or for control. Musk nodded slightly, his expression unshaken. Then, he leaned forward just an inch, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. The public, he repeated, or what they've been told to believe. A murmur rippled through the audience. The atmosphere in the studio changed in an instant. Musk wasn't just answering. He was challenging the very premise of the question. Rachel tightened her grip on the table. She couldn't lose control this early. She had spent days preparing for this. She flipped through her notes, shifting tactics. Let's talk specifics, she said, regaining her edge. Twitter. You took over one of the most influential platforms on the planet, fired thousands of employees, and completely changed how content is moderated. Some say you restored free speech. Others say you created chaos. Do you take responsibility for that? A direct attack. a statement designed to corner him. But Musk didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow breath, then leaned forward, locking eyes with her. His voice was steady, his words razor-sharp. I believe in personal responsibility. I believe people should think for themselves, not be spoon-fed a version of reality curated by a handful of elites. Rachel didn't miss a beat. You're saying there should be no rules? No accountability? Musk's expression didn't change. I'm saying history has shown us a dangerous truth. When a small group decides what people are allowed to see, it ceases to be truth. It becomes power. A few audience members nodded. Others whispered among themselves. The balance of the conversation had shifted yet again. Rachel straightened, her mind racing. The moment Musk flipped the script on her last question, she knew this wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't just answering. He was challenging the entire premise of the discussion. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the tension between them. The entire nation was watching. Millions of Americans sitting in their living rooms, glued to their screens. Some were rooting for Rachel, believing she was the last line of defense against unchecked power. Others? They were hanging on Musk's every word, waiting for him to expose what they suspected all along, that the media wasn't here to ask questions. It was here to control the answers. Rachel forced herself to stay in control. She flipped to her next set of notes, her voice sharp. Elon, let's cut through the rhetoric. You talk about freedom of speech, about giving people the power to think for themselves. But isn't it true that under your leadership, Twitter, X, has become a platform where extremism thrives? Where misinformation spreads unchecked? Where some of the most dangerous voices now have a louder megaphone? A direct strike. One meant to put him on the defensive. Musk's face remained unreadable. He didn't look away, didn't fidget, didn't rush to respond. Instead, he let the weight of the accusation settle in the air. Then, in a voice so calm it almost felt unnerving, he asked, Rachel, who decides what is dangerous? Rachel blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. What do you mean? Musk leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharper now. You just made a claim. Dangerous voices now have a louder megaphone. But who decides what's dangerous? You? The government? A group of so-called experts? Because history has shown us time and time again that the people in power are not always right. In fact, they are often wrong. He let that sit for a moment, scanning the audience, making sure they were following. And they were. Rachel inhaled, pushing forward. So, are you saying there should be no moderation at all? That anyone should be allowed to say anything, no matter the consequences? Musk shook his head, his voice steady. I'm saying truth should not fear scrutiny. Lies require censorship. Truth does not. A murmur spread through the audience. Some nodded, others exchanged glances. Something was shifting. Rachel's grip on her pen tightened. She needed to pivot. She couldn't let this conversation slip away from her. She exhaled, her voice firm. Elon, I think we both agree that misinformation is dangerous. Musk tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Rachel continued, let's talk about the power you hold. You don't just own X. You own Tesla, SpaceX, Starlink. You control industries that shape our economy, our infrastructure, even how we communicate. That is an unprecedented amount of influence in the hands of one man. Who holds you accountable? She delivered the question like a dagger, knowing it was one he couldn't avoid. This time, Musk didn't immediately respond. He sat there, fingers interlaced, eyes locked onto hers. The silence stretched long enough that the tension in the room became unbearable. Then, finally, he spoke. That is a very good question. Rachel arched an eyebrow. She had expected deflection, not admission. Musk exhaled, glancing briefly toward the cameras before looking back at her. His voice was quieter now, but somehow, it carried even more weight. That's something I ask myself every single day. The audience stilled. Rachel hesitated. Musk continued, the difference between someone who protects the truth and someone who abuses power is not how much control they have. It's whether they allow people to question them. His voice dropped even lower. The day I stop allowing people to question me, That's the day I become the very thing I warned against. The room was silent. Rachel stared at him, her carefully structured argument crumbling at the edges. Because Musk hadn't fought back, he had embraced the question. And in doing so, he had left everyone, including her, with something far more dangerous than an answer. A question they would now have to ask themselves. Rachel Dawson felt it, the momentum shifting. She was losing ground. For years, she had prided herself on being the journalist who could break the most unshakable of figures. But Musk? He wasn't breaking. He wasn't dodging. He wasn't even playing defense. He was turning her questions back on themselves, forcing her, not him, to justify her stance. She needed to take back control. Rachel adjusted in her seat, flipping a page in her notes, more for effect than necessity. Her voice, sharper now, carried an unmistakable edge. Elon, you speak about transparency, about allowing people to challenge power. But let's be real. You are one of the most powerful men in the world. And let's not pretend you don't use that power. You decide who gets a platform. You decide who gets silenced. You claim to be different from the institutions you criticize, but at the end of the day, aren't you just another gatekeeper? A strong question, one meant to trap him. If he denied controlling speech, she could cite the countless accounts that had been suspended or shadow banned under his leadership. If he admitted it, she could paint him as hypocritical. Musk, however, didn't take the bait. Instead, he let out a slow breath, his expression unwavering. Rachel, let me ask you something. Rachel tensed slightly. She knew this pattern by now. Why do you think people trust me more than they trust mainstream media? The air in the studio thickened. The audience barely moved. Rachel's jaw clenched, just slightly. He had flipped it again. She exhaled. That's not the point. Musk tilted his head slightly. Oh, but it is. He gestured lightly toward the cameras, the audience, even the crew. Millions of people used to trust what they saw on the news. Now, they're skeptical. They don't just question the stories. They question the motives behind them. And when they see someone like me, who has no allegiance to political parties, no reliance on corporate advertisers, no ties to old media institutions, why wouldn't they believe that I'm being more honest than you? Rachel's grip on her pen tightened. She wasn't about to let this turn into a monologue. Elon, the issue isn't whether people trust you. The issue is whether they should. You control social media, AI, satellites, electric vehicles. You don't just shape conversations, you shape economies. You say you believe in free thought, but what happens when your beliefs shape the world itself? It was her strongest attack yet, and she knew it. She could see it in the flicker of something behind Musk's eyes. For the first time, he paused. He glanced downward for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible moment, but Rachel caught it. Then he looked back up, his gaze unreadable. That's a fair question. Rachel straightened slightly, sensing an opening. But Musk wasn't conceding. He was setting up his next move. Here's the thing, Rachel. His voice was quieter now, more measured. Power isn't the enemy. The real question is, who gets to wield it? And if it's not me, then who? The audience inhaled collectively. Rachel stared at him, trying to calculate her next step, because she realized this wasn't a debate anymore. It was a reckoning. Rachel Dawson felt the heat rising, not from the studio lights, but from the intensity of the exchange. She was losing control. This wasn't how the interview was supposed to go. She had prepared, rehearsed, and anticipated every possible response Musk could throw her way. But what she hadn't counted on was this, the unsettling ease with which he dismantled her arguments. She had asked him about power, expecting him to either deny or deflect. Instead, he had done something far more dangerous. He had embraced the question. Rachel inhaled sharply, pushing forward. She couldn't afford to falter now. Elon, you just admitted that power isn't the enemy, but history tells us otherwise. Absolute power corrupts. Every leader who started out claiming to protect the people, to challenge the system, eventually became the very thing they once opposed. What makes you different? Musk exhaled slowly, as if he had been expecting this all along. His gaze remained locked on her, unwavering. Because I don't silence the people who challenge me. The words landed like a hammer. Rachel's fingers instinctively tightened around her pen. Are you sure about that? She pressed. Because many would argue that you do. People have been banned from X. Content has been throttled. Some voices are amplified, while others disappear. So tell me, Elon, who decides what stays and what goes? Musk leaned back slightly, considering. He didn't rush. He didn't react. When he spoke, his voice was measured, deliberate. I don't decide. The people do. Rachel blinked. That's not an answer. Musk's lips curled into the faintest smirk. It's the only answer that matters. She opened her mouth to counter, but he raised a hand slightly, signaling he wasn't finished. You see, Rachel, the difference between me and the so-called gatekeepers of the past is simple. I'm not telling people what to believe. I'm not controlling the flow of information. I'm giving people access to all of it. The good, the bad, the uncomfortable. And instead of deciding for them, I let them decide for themselves. He let the words settle, scanning the audience. And they were listening. Rachel knew she had to strike now, before she lost them completely. She flipped to the final page of her notes. The last, most damning question. She leaned forward, voice steady, eyes locked onto his. Elon, you talk about transparency, about giving power to the people. But let's be real. You hold more power than some governments. Tesla, SpaceX, Starlink X, these aren't just companies. They shape economies, infrastructure, even national security. If one day you decided to use that power for yourself, who would stop you? The studio fell into a suffocating silence. Musk didn't look away, didn't blink. Then after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. That's a very good question. Rachel felt her heartbeat quicken. She had him, or so she thought. Musk exhaled, his voice quieter, but carrying more weight than before. It's a question I ask myself every single day. Rachel froze. The audience did too. Because Musk hadn't evaded. He hadn't denied. Instead, he had done something no one expected. He had turned the question on himself. And for the first time that night, Rachel Dawson, the woman who had built her career on being unshakable, felt shaken. Elon Musk's response had derailed her strategy in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had expected deflection, denial, maybe even an attempt at humor to soften the weight of the question. But instead, he had looked her dead in the eye and admitted it. He asked himself the very same question she had thrown at him. Rachel could feel the shift happening, not just in the air around her, but inside her own mind. The very foundation of the interview had cracked. The objective had been to corner Musk, to expose contradictions in his philosophy, to paint him as just another powerful man refusing to acknowledge the consequences of his influence. Yet here he was acknowledging them first. She tightened her grip on her pen, trying to regain her footing. She wasn't here to lose. She exhaled, her voice steady. Elon, you're saying that you constantly question your own power. But self-awareness alone isn't enough. If you ever cross the line, who would hold you accountable? Musk leaned back slightly, fingers interlocked, eyes unreadable. For the first time, he looked reflective. I would hope the people would. Rachel arched an eyebrow. Hope. Musk let out a small breath, as if choosing his words carefully. The greatest safeguard against tyranny isn't laws or policies. It's an informed public that refuses to be controlled. That's why I do what I do. Not to hoard power, but to decentralize it. To put the tools of information back in people's hands so they never have to take someone like me at my word. The way he said it unsettled her. Not because it was aggressive or defensive, but because it felt true. Rachel pressed forward. But Elon, you're asking the public to hold you accountable. What if they don't? What if your influence grows beyond even their ability to challenge you? Musk gave a slow, knowing nod. That's why I encourage people to question everything, including me. Rachel studied him carefully. He wasn't playing a role. This wasn't some carefully curated PR response. There was no nervous shifting, no rushed attempts to reframe the conversation. He meant every word. She felt something deep in her gut. A realization she hadn't expected. The problem wasn't that Musk had too much power. The problem was that, in a world where institutions had lost the trust of the people, Musk was one of the only people they still believed in. and that made him more powerful than anyone had yet dared to admit. She exhaled, setting her pen down for the first time that night. Musk caught the movement. His lips curled slightly, as if recognizing something unspoken between them. For the first time, Rachel Dawson didn't have another question, because she realized this conversation was no longer about Elon Musk. It was about all of us. Rachel Dawson sat motionless, pen resting on the desk in front of her. She had prepared for this interview, but she hadn't prepared for this feeling. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she was still the one in control. The audience felt it too. No one shifted in their seats. No one whispered. They were waiting, not for the next attack, not for a gotcha moment, but for something far more important. A conclusion. A resolution. Rachel exhaled slowly, steadying herself. If she was going to end this, she had to do it right. She straightened in her chair, meeting Musk's gaze head-on. Elon, you've built empires. You've defied institutions. You've changed the way we think about the future. But let me ask you this. If everything you say is true, if power should be decentralized, if people should question everything, then what happens when they start questioning you? Musk's expression didn't shift. He didn't blink. He welcomed the question. His voice, quieter now, but just as commanding, cut through the silence. They should. Rachel waited. But that was it. That was his answer. She let out a short breath. And if they decide you're wrong? A hint of something. Was it relief? Crossed Musk's face. Then I lose. A ripple of murmurs swept through the studio. The audience wasn't expecting that. Neither was Rachel. She studied him carefully, looking for cracks, for hesitation. But she found none. Elon Musk was not afraid of losing. Rachel felt something shift inside her. She had spent years exposing powerful figures, forcing them to admit uncomfortable truths. But this was something she had never encountered before. A man who was willing to stand by his words, no matter the cost. She could end the interview here. She could thank him, turn to the camera, and wrap up with a polished, controlled narrative. Or she could do what she had always told herself she stood for. She could tell the truth. Rachel took a deep breath and turned toward the camera, facing the millions of Americans watching from their screens. Her voice, no longer sharp, no longer rehearsed, carried something it hadn't before: raw sincerity. Tonight, I asked Elon Musk many questions. But perhaps the most important question wasn't one I asked him. It's one we should all be asking ourselves. She let the weight of the moment settle. Are we willing to think for ourselves? Are we willing to challenge power, no matter where it comes from? A long silence followed. Then, for the first time that night, Musk smiled. Because in that moment, Rachel Dawson had stopped trying to win. She had started listening. For the first time in her career, Rachel Dawson didn't know how to close the show. She had come into this interview armed with facts, statistics, and hard-hitting questions, ready to break down Elon Musk, to push him into a corner he couldn't escape from. But now, she wasn't sure if she had been the one leading the conversation at all. The battle she had prepared for had never arrived. Instead, what had unfolded was something far more unsettling. Musk hadn't tried to overpower her. He hadn't dodged her toughest questions. He had answered them, and then turned them back on her, on the audience, on the entire system. She looked across the table at him. He wasn't smiling in victory. He wasn't smirking as if he had won. He simply sat there, composed, unshaken, watching her with a quiet understanding. The studio was frozen in silence. Even the audience, who had expected a dramatic climax, an explosive final confrontation, sat motionless. No whispers, no murmurs, just the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Rachel turned toward the camera. Her perfectly rehearsed closing statement? Useless now. She couldn't end this interview the way she had planned. She took a slow breath, feeling her own heartbeat steadying. And then she spoke, not as a journalist, not as an interviewer, but as a person who had just witnessed something profound. We live in a world where we are constantly being told what to think, what to believe, who to trust. She let the words settle, her voice softer now, less commanding but somehow more powerful. Tonight, I sat across from one of the most powerful men in the world and asked him if he was any different. if he too would fall into the same cycle of control, of unchecked influence. She turned to Musk, her expression unreadable. And the truth is, I don't know. Musk didn't react. He didn't need to. Rachel looked back at the audience. Her voice was clear, unwavering. But maybe that's the point. Maybe we're not supposed to blindly trust anyone. Maybe we're supposed to always ask questions, even when we don't like the answers. The audience remained silent. No applause, no movement, just thought. Rachel leaned in slightly, her tone firm. So tonight, I won't end this interview with a statement. I'll end it with a question. Not for Elon Musk, but for you, the people watching at home. She paused, the tension thick in the air. Then her next words landed like a challenge. Are you thinking for yourself? Musk's expression remained unchanged, but there was something in his eyes, an acknowledgement, a quiet approval. The camera zoomed in, capturing every detail of the moment. Rachel inhaled deeply before delivering her final words. That's the real debate. And it doesn't end here. She turned back to Musk. Her tone had softened, but there was still an edge of respect in it. Elon, thank you for being here. Musk nodded, his voice even measured. Thank you, Rachel. He stood up, adjusting his jacket. No triumphant smile, no arrogance, just a quiet understanding between two people who had both walked away changed. The screen behind them faded to black. The studio lights dimmed. The conversation was over. But the questions had only just begun. This wasn't just an interview. It was a battle of ideas, a confrontation that left no one untouched. Elon Musk didn't just answer tough questions. He tore apart the very foundation of how we consume information. He didn't just defend himself. He forced us to ask whether we truly control our own thoughts or if someone else does. For years, we've been told what to believe. We've been fed narratives, handed convenient truths, and punished for questioning them. But tonight, Musk threw out a challenge. Truth does not fear scrutiny. Only lies do. And for the first time, Rachel Dawson, the journalist known for exposing the powerful, was forced to pause. But here's the real question. Did Musk expose the system, or did he expose himself? Because if one man can challenge an entire industry, control vast platforms, and influence billions of minds, how is he any different from the institutions he criticizes? Is Musk a force for truth, or just another master of the game? Do you believe in absolute free speech, or should power be kept in check? Most importantly, are you thinking for yourself, or just choosing a side in someone else's war? Now, we need your voice. Drop a comment below. Agree, disagree, argue, challenge, but don't stay silent. And if this conversation shook you even a little, hit like, subscribe, and share this video. Because one thing is clear. The debate doesn't end here. It's only just begun.